When I collapsed at work, the doctors called my parents. They never came. Instead, my sister tagged me in a photo. Family day, without the drama. I said nothing. Days later, still weak and hooked to machines, I saw 74 missed calls and a text from Dad. "We need you. Answer immediately." Without thinking twice, I'd had a feeling something was wrong for weeks. Headaches, dizziness, tightness in my chest that came and went just fast enough for me to pretend it wasn't serious. I kept pushing through because slowing down had never really been an option in my family. Mom's car payment was partly my problem. Melissa needed a quick loan every other week. Dad somehow treated his missed mortgage payments like emergencies I was responsible for solving. From the outside, though, we looked perfect. Smiling birthday photos, lake weekends, matching holiday pictures. Nobody saw what happened after those pictures were taken, when everyone quietly turned toward me and waited for me to fix whatever had gone wrong. Melissa and Paige had always existed under different rules. They could wreck something, waste money, make terrible decisions, and somehow my parents would call it a learning experience. I could succeed, and barely get acknowledgement. I once won a statewide engineering award, and Mom glanced at the certificate and said, "That's nice. Did you thank your teacher?" Eventually, I stopped wanting praise. I told myself gratitude would be enough. A simple recognition that I was carrying more than my share. But even that never came. So I worked harder. Weekends disappeared. My savings became everyone else's emergency fund. I kept telling myself this was what a good daughter did. Then came that Monday afternoon. I was preparing a presentation for a major client when I stood up to grab a folder from the printer. 1 second, I was walking across the office. The next, there was nothing. Blackness. I woke under fluorescent lights with wires attached to my chest and a nurse adjusting an IV beside me. For a few confused seconds, I thought I had fainted from exhaustion. Then the doctor explained it slowly. It hadn't been dehydration. It hadn't been anxiety. I had suffered a cardiac event, and if I hadn't collapsed in an office surrounded by people who immediately called 911, the outcome could have been much worse. My coworkers were the reason I was alive. That fact stayed with me because the people who were supposed to be closest to me were nowhere to be found. The hospital contacted my emergency numbers. My parents were notified. I waited through the first evening, telling myself traffic was bad. I waited through the next morning, assuming they were arranging something. By the second night, I stopped asking the nurses whether anyone had called. 2 full days passed without a text, a visit, or even a voicemail. On the third day, I woke from a nap and checked my phone. One notification. Melissa had tagged me on Instagram. I opened it, expecting some clumsy message about my hospitalization. Instead, there they were, Melissa, Paige, Mom, and Dad, sitting around a picnic table beside the lake, smiling into the camera. Mom had brought her signature deviled eggs. Dad had his arm behind Paige. Everyone looked relaxed. Happy. Normal. Beneath the photo was the caption, "Family day without the drama," and they had tagged me. I stared at the screen until it went dark in my hand. Somehow, that hurt worse than hearing the doctor say the words, "cardiac event." They knew where I was. They knew why I was there. Yet while machines tracked every beat of my heart, they were eating potato salad and joking online about how much nicer the family was without me. I didn't comment. I didn't call. I didn't send an angry message. Something simply closed inside me. Quietly. Permanently. 4 days after my collapse, my phone erupted. When I woke that morning, I had 74 missed calls. Mom, Dad, Paige, Melissa. Over and over. For one irrational second, I thought maybe they had finally understood what happened and were panicking about me. Then I saw Dad's message. "We need you. Answer immediately." No. How are you? No apology. No. We should have come. Just need. That word told me everything. I sat there listening to the heart monitor beside me. feeling strangely calm. In the past, those missed calls would have triggered panic. I would have called before even knowing the problem. I would have started calculating what I could transfer, borrow, delay, or sacrifice. But this time I remembered another number, one I hadn't dialed in months. I had avoided calling him because I knew exactly what he would say about my family, and I hadn't wanted to admit he had been right. My grandfather answered on the second ring. He didn't lecture me. He didn't ask why I had disappeared. He just said, "Which hospital?" 40 minutes later, Gramps walked into my room wearing the same old windbreaker and the watch he'd owned since I was a kid. He sat beside the bed, studied the wires running across my chest, then looked straight at me. "So," he said quietly, "they finally broke you too, huh?" I couldn't answer. I just nodded. He stayed all day. He spoke with my nurse. He asked questions I hadn't had the energy to ask. When one test wasn't fully covered by insurance, he quietly handled the cost before I could protest. Then he opened his tablet and asked me to show him everything tied to my family. What we found made my stomach turn. 5 loan agreements, 3 credit cards, 2 utility accounts, Mom's car insurance, a vehicle policy for a car I didn't even drive, automatic transfers to Melissa, rent assistance for Paige. Financial obligations layered so deeply into my life that I had stopped noticing them. That was when I finally understood. They hadn't merely leaned on me. They had leaned through me. I wasn't their daughter when I needed them. I wasn't their sister when I was lying in a hospital bed. I was the pressure valve, the backup account, the person they blamed for drama while depending on me to prevent their lives from collapsing. Gramps helped me make a list. Then we started cutting the strings. Melissa's automatic transfer canceled. She claimed she was barely surviving, yet somehow had taken 3 Miami trips that year. Paige's rent assistance stopped. Mom's insurance payment removed. I changed passwords, deleted stored cards, redirected account access, and reviewed every loan carrying my name. One agreement connected to Melissa contained information I had never knowingly approved, so I flagged it for investigation instead of continuing to absorb the risk. By evening, my phone had become unusable. Calls doubled. Mom left a voicemail saying she had just heard what happened, despite the hospital having contacted her days earlier. Paige started sending messages in all caps. Melissa went strangely silent, which usually meant she was preparing something worse. Then Dad texted again. "This is serious. Call me now. Everything is falling apart." I looked at the words for a long moment. Still nothing about my heart. Nothing about the hospital. Nothing about whether I was going to survive. Their emergency had finally arrived, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to save them from it. The fallout started before I even left the hospital. At first, it was voicemail after voicemail, each one somehow more offended than worried. Mom finally left one long enough for me to play on speaker. "I don't know what you're trying to prove," she said, her voice sharp with irritation, "but this isn't the way to do it." I stared at the ceiling while the message ended. No question about my condition. No apology for spending their lake day joking about me while I was hooked to a heart monitor. She sounded like a customer complaining that a service she had always depended on had suddenly stopped working. Melissa texted next. First came a screenshot of her checking account showing $29. Then 4 words. "What is going on?" A minute later, "Fix this." Paige took the softer route. She said she hated conflict, that she loved everyone, that she wanted peace. Then she added, "Please don't punish me for things I didn't do." Apparently, accepting my rent payments for months while barely speaking to me counted as neutrality. Dad was the one who made their real fear obvious. Gramps told me he had seen Dad's car outside my apartment building, even though I was still hospitalized. He had apparently driven there, parked across the street, and waited as if I might magically return home and explain myself. Later, a message came through. "You're about to destroy everything we've built. I hope you understand the damage you're causing." I actually laughed, and the movement hurt my chest. Everything we had built? Their version of we apparently meant my income, my credit, my signatures, my automatic transfers, and their decisions. Not once had any of them called what I contributed mine. It was always family money until I stopped providing it. Then suddenly, I was stealing something from them. The next afternoon, Melissa uploaded a video. I only saw it because Gramps quietly turned his tablet toward me. The camera moved through my parents' house room by room. The living room was empty. The dining table was gone. Curtains had been taken down. Boxes sat near the entrance, and the front door was propped open. Her caption said, "They took everything. And guess who let them?" I knew immediately what had happened. My parents had defaulted on the mortgage again. Months earlier, they had borrowed against the equity, supposedly to stabilize their finances. Instead, a large portion had gone toward Melissa's credit card debt and Paige's latest online business idea. I had warned them that I would not rescue the mortgage again. They smiled, nodded, and assumed I didn't mean it. Now the bank had finally stopped assuming someone else would cover the consequences. Gramps helped me pull the documents. Late notices, penalties, missed payments, letters mailed directly to my parents' address that they had never shown me. As we went through everything, his expression changed. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. He asked me to rest while he stepped into the hallway and made several calls to his attorney, his accountant, and an estate planner I hadn't known he worked with. When he returned, he sat beside me and told me something I hadn't expected. My family hadn't only been positioning themselves around my money. They had started circling his, too. Paige had suddenly begun inviting him to brunch after years of barely calling. Melissa had brought him an expensive Christmas present for the first time in a decade. Mom had casually asked whether his estate plan was fair to everyone. Gramps had recognized the pattern immediately. He had already protected himself. His properties, investment accounts, and estate assets had been reorganized so none of them could manipulate their way into control. Then he told me he had changed the successor structure again. Most of what he owned would eventually be placed under my responsibility. I protested instantly. I didn't want his money. I didn't want another reason for my family to accuse me of stealing something. Gramps shook his head. "That," he said, "is exactly why I trust you with it. You're the only person who never asked." The sentence terrified me more than it comforted me, because I understood what would happen if Melissa and Paige found out. That same evening, Melissa appeared at the hospital. Security stopped her downstairs because she wasn't listed as someone authorized to visit. From my window, I could see her pacing beside the entrance with her phone pressed to her ear. She wore sunglasses even though the sun was disappearing, and every few seconds she gestured angrily with her free hand. After 15 minutes, she left. An hour later, I received a message. "If you don't fix this, you're going to regret it." I expected fear to hit me. It didn't. Her threat felt strangely small compared with everything else I had finally understood. She wasn't angry because her sister had almost died. She was angry because her sister had survived long enough to say no. The real escalation came the following morning. A hospital administrator entered my room and asked whether I had authorized someone named Paige to speak with my doctors. I said no. The administrator explained that Paige was downstairs claiming to be my medical proxy and insisting that my recent behavior was proof I was not thinking clearly. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Paige, who hadn't visited me once, was now trying to make medical decisions for me. I told them the only family member authorized to receive information was Gramps. Security escorted her from the building. I thought that would be the worst of it. A few hours later, Gramps arrived, carrying a manila folder. Inside were copies of communications his attorney had obtained, involving my parents and a small local law firm. I read the first page twice before understanding what I was looking at. My parents were asking about emergency guardianship and temporary conservatorship. Their argument was that my cardiac event had triggered some kind of psychological breakdown, and that my decision to stop funding them showed irrational financial behavior. They wanted Dad placed in temporary control of my affairs so he could supposedly protect me from myself. In reality, that would give him a path to challenge the financial changes I had made and regain access to accounts tied to the family. The betrayal was almost impressive in its completeness. 4 days earlier, they couldn't be bothered to visit the hospital. Now they were preparing to tell a court they cared so deeply about my health that they needed legal authority over my life. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I asked Gramps for the attorney's number. By evening, a lawyer was sitting beside my hospital bed with a legal pad open. We documented everything: the ignored hospital notifications, the financial accounts, the threatening messages, Paige's attempt to impersonate my medical representative, and Dad's demand that I reverse my decisions. My doctors prepared statements confirming that I was mentally competent, alert, and fully capable of managing my affairs. We moved fast. Formal notices were prepared barring my parents and sisters from obtaining medical information. Fraud alerts were placed with financial institutions where any family member had previously shared access. Accounts were transferred. Passwords changed. My employer redirected my deposits to a new bank. Assets carrying my signature were flagged, so no transfer could occur without direct verification from me. For the first time, my family could not simply make a decision and assume I would discover it after the fact. The doors were closing faster than they could reach them. So Paige changed the battlefield. That night, she uploaded a video. Her makeup was smudged, her voice trembling at exactly the right moments. She never said my name, but she didn't need to. "Someone in our family is going through something very dark," she told the camera. "We're trying to help her, but she's pushing everyone away and hurting people who love her." Then came the phrase that made my stomach turn. "We can't keep letting her destroy everything we've built." Melissa reposted it with a heart and wrote, "Praying for peace." Within hours, cousins I hadn't heard from in years began sending messages asking whether I was okay. I understood what they were doing. If they couldn't regain control of my money, they would try to control the story. They would turn my boundaries into instability, my silence into cruelty, and my hospitalization into evidence that I couldn't be trusted. I could have posted every screenshot right then. Instead, I chose one photograph. Gramps sitting beside my hospital bed, while I managed a tired smile. My caption was only one sentence. "Sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's restraint, nothing more." 2 hours later, Melissa called. Then Paige. Then Mom. I ignored every one of them. Dad's text came last. "We didn't want it to come to this. You're forcing us to do things we never wanted to do." I read it once and placed the phone face down. Because by then, I knew exactly what they still hadn't figured out. They thought I was defending myself from them. They didn't realize I had finally started preparing for them. The legal letter arrived 2 days later, hand-delivered to the hospital in a crisp white envelope. For one stupid second, I thought maybe it was an apology. Maybe somebody had finally looked at what they were doing and realized how far they had gone. Instead, it was a notice of intent to pursue emergency conservatorship over me. According to the filing, my decision to cut off financial support after suffering a cardiac event demonstrated erratic behavior, emotional instability, and an inability to meet my obligations. Their definition of an obligation, apparently, was continuing to pay bills that were never mine. I called my lawyer immediately. He wasn't surprised. He explained that they were likely hoping to move fast enough to obtain temporary authority before I could properly respond. If I failed to appear or provide evidence of competence, they might persuade a judge to temporarily freeze decisions I had already made. What my parents didn't know was that Gramps and his legal team had anticipated exactly that move. By the following morning, our response was ready. My doctors provided notarized statements confirming I was mentally competent, fully oriented, and capable of making independent financial and medical decisions. My employer confirmed that I remained employed and had voluntarily taken medical leave. We submitted account histories showing that my recent changes weren't random spending or reckless withdrawals. They were cancellations of payments I had been making on behalf of other adults. We included Paige's attempt to impersonate my medical proxy, Dad's messages demanding access, and Melissa's threat. The emergency petition collapsed almost immediately. Their attorney withdrew before the matter ever became the courtroom showdown my family had clearly imagined. They had tried to transform my first real boundary into evidence of insanity, and all they had done was create a paper trail, proving why I needed that boundary in the first place. But losing legally didn't stop them. It only pushed them harder toward the story they could control. Strange messages began arriving from people I hadn't spoken to in years. A former coworker wrote that she was sorry to hear I was struggling. A man I had dated years earlier sent a careful message, asking whether I had anyone helping me through my breakdown. Even an old neighbor contacted me. That was when I realized Paige's video had spread far beyond our immediate circle. My family was quietly telling people that my hospitalization had caused some kind of psychological crisis, and that my financial decisions were symptoms of it. They couldn't prove I was unstable in court, so they were trying to make everyone else believe it anyway. Paige posted again. This time the video looked almost professionally staged. Soft lighting, melancholy piano music, carefully applied makeup designed to look like she had been crying. She talked about how mental illness didn't always look the way people expected, and how painful it was to watch someone you loved become unrecognizable. Then she looked directly into the camera and said she simply wanted her sister back. She never used my name, but everyone knew exactly who she meant. The comments filled with sympathy. "You're such a good sister. She's lucky to have a family fighting for her. Stay strong." Melissa shared the video immediately. Mom commented with a broken heart emoji. For about a day, their version of events seemed to be working. Then one person posted a screenshot. It was Melissa's lake photo, the one taken while I was lying in the hospital, with the caption, "Family Day without the drama." Beside it was a screenshot of Paige crying about how desperately she wanted her sister back. The person who posted it wrote one simple question. Where was all this concern when she was actually in the hospital? That was enough. People started looking backward through their accounts. They found Mom's cheerful dinner photos posted after the hospital had already contacted her. They found old posts from Paige mocking people who used trauma as an excuse. They found Melissa's vacations from months when she had publicly complained she couldn't afford groceries. Every contradiction they had forgotten was suddenly sitting next to their new claims. The shift happened faster than I expected. Paige's boutique was flooded with angry comments and refund requests. Collaborators quietly removed her tags. Melissa lost sponsorships after brands began receiving screenshots of her posts. One company she had worked with publicly distanced itself from her. Dad's workplace became involved after a client saw one of the viral threads and mentioned it during a meeting. Dad apparently became defensive enough that management opened an internal review. First, he was placed on leave. Then, by the end of the week, he was gone. I watched all of this from my hospital bed without celebrating. I didn't feel victorious. Mostly, I felt exhausted. These weren't consequences I had engineered. They were consequences of a story my family had chosen to tell publicly without realizing people could check the parts they had left out. Mom finally sent me a message that was different from the others. "Please, can we talk?" 5 words. No accusation, no demand, no speech about family. I stared at them longer than I expected. A year earlier, maybe even a month earlier, those words would have broken me. I would have imagined reconciliation before the conversation even started. Now they felt like they had come from someone across a great distance. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened the notes on my phone and continued making a list of every remaining account, contact, beneficiary designation, and document that still connected me to them. I wasn't interested in winning anymore. I wanted clean separation. I was discharged soon afterward. I still moved slowly, but I could walk without assistance, and Gramps insisted I stay with him instead of returning to my apartment. We were halfway to his house when my phone buzzed from an unknown number. "You should really come by the house. We need to talk urgently." I recognized Paige's style immediately and deleted it. 2 hours later, my old high school friend Jen called and told me to look at Facebook. Melissa had posted another family performance. Mom, Dad, Paige and Melissa were standing outside the house they had lost with a U-Haul behind them. Dad held a cardboard box. Mom looked exhausted. Melissa's caption read, "Losing everything hurts, especially when it happens because your own blood turns against you. But we forgive her. She's still our sister. We just want her to come home before it's too late." The last photo disturbed me more than the caption. Paige was holding a framed childhood picture of me. Underneath it were the words, "We're keeping a room ready. Family is forever." It felt less like love than an emotional ransom note. They were still presenting themselves as generous people, willing to forgive the daughter and sister who had supposedly destroyed them. They wanted strangers to believe there was a place waiting for me if I would just stop resisting. The truth was simpler. There had never been a place for me in that family unless I was useful. The strangest move came the next day. A letter arrived containing information about a new will Dad had drafted after the conservatorship attempt failed. He had almost nothing left, which made the gesture darkly funny, but he still found a way to turn inheritance into leverage. The document said his remaining assets would go only to family members who maintained unity. Then, in handwriting beneath the formal language, he had added, "My daughter is disinherited until she returns to this family and reconciles." I read the sentence twice and started laughing, not because I wanted his estate. I never had. I laughed because after medical manipulation, financial pressure, public humiliation, threats, and legal intimidation, his final weapon was still the same one my family had always used. Belong on our terms, or be erased. What Dad didn't understand was that being erased sounded peaceful. I asked my lawyer to send a response. It included a formal waiver giving up any possible claim to Dad's estate, a permanent no-contact notice, and updated documents removing my parents and sisters as emergency contacts, next of kin, representatives, or decision-makers in any medical or legal matter involving me. There was nothing emotional in the letter. No accusations. No final speech. I wasn't asking them to understand anymore. They had tried money, guilt, public shame, fear, and finally legacy. I chose none of it. 2 weeks later, Gramps and I moved out of state. He told me he wanted to see the mountains again, so we found a small cabin outside, a quiet town where mornings smelled like pine instead of traffic. I took a remote position, reduced my hours, and began rebuilding routines that weren't designed around somebody else's emergency. I read books again. I cooked because I wanted to, not because someone needed something from me. Some afternoons I sat outside with Gramps without talking at all. Silence used to make me anxious because it meant I was waiting for the next demand. There, silence meant nothing was wrong. Every so often, someone from the old life still tries to contact me, a cousin, an old neighbor, somebody asking what really happened. I rarely explain. Melissa, Paige, Mom, and Dad will always have their version, the one where they were betrayed by an unstable daughter and sister who suddenly abandoned her family. They can keep telling it. I spent too much of my life trying to earn love from people who only seemed to love the things I provided. I don't need their version corrected anymore. I know what happened. I know who came when I was lying alone in that hospital room, and I know who only started calling when the money stopped. For years, I thought peace would come when my family finally appreciated me. I was wrong. Peace came when I stopped requiring their appreciation at all. And I learned something I wish I had understood much sooner. Being alone is not the worst thing that can happen to you. Sometimes being loved only when you're useful is far lonelier.